Claire had never been one to shy away from new beginnings. She had left her small town up north, seeking a fresh start in a place that seemed to hum with a different rhythm. A town known for its old-time charm. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The streets were lined with aging buildings, the kind that seemed to hold more stories than any person could tell. As she stepped out of her car and walked into the diner, Claire didn't expect the heavy weight of history to hang in the air like a thick fog. The bell above the door jingled as Claire entered, causing a few heads to turn. The diner was sparsely populated, with only a few booths occupied by elderly white men who leaned over their coffee cups and discussed the world in muted tones. The walls of the diner were a dull beige, aged from years of smoke and steam. It wasn't much, certainly not a place that made an impression at first glance. But Claire could sense that the place held something more than its faded walls and chipped counters. Something unseen, something unsettling. Behind the counter, a woman, black, in her mid-30s, with sharp eyes and an air of quiet resilience, glanced up from her work. She was wiping down the counter, her hands moving with practiced grace. The woman had an easy, professional smile, but there was something about her demeanor that suggested she was used to something that Claire couldn't quite put her finger on. "Morning," the woman said softly, not quite meeting Claire's eyes. "Morning," Claire replied, her voice still unsure as she glanced at the menu. Her eyes flicked back to the woman, who had already turned to the coffee machine, her back now to Claire. The woman's name, as Claire soon learned, was Tanya. Tanya's tone was always polite, but it didn't take long for Claire to notice that Tanya seemed to carry a certain distance. There was something guarded about the way she moved, the way she spoke. As Claire sat down in a booth by the window, she observed Tanya from across the room, noting how the other customers seemed to treat her with a peculiar coldness. Claire's food came promptly: eggs, toast, coffee. The meal wasn't remarkable, but Tanya's mannerisms stuck in her mind. There was something dignified in her movements, an unspoken strength in the way she carried herself despite the subtle slights Claire could almost feel radiating from the patrons around her. It was Claire's second day at the diner, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the space was different, charged in some way. The coffee in front of her was lukewarm, but she didn't mind. She was there for more than the food. She had come to observe. Tanya wasn't in her usual spot, and Claire couldn't help but notice that the other staff members didn't speak to her much, if at all. Tanya soon appeared, gliding in with a tray full of coffee cups, her movements measured. She set them down on the counter with practiced ease, then met Claire's gaze. Claire smiled and nodded as Tanya approached her table. "You're back again," Tanya remarked, her voice soft but steady. "I guess I am," Claire said, glancing up at the menu before meeting Tanya's eyes. "Your coffee's good. I've been meaning to ask, how long have you worked here?" Tanya hesitated for a moment, then said, "A while? Too long, probably." She managed to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was an unspoken truth in her words, one that Claire was just beginning to sense. Claire sipped her coffee, watching Tanya as she moved around the diner. There was a quiet grace to the way she handled herself, even in the face of the occasional cruel remark from the regulars. As Claire's stay at the diner continued, she began to realize that the atmosphere in the small establishment was more charged than it seemed at first. Every time Tanya moved past a group of regulars, there was an unspoken tension. They would mumble insults too low for Claire to catch at first, but their eyes would flicker over Tanya, sizing her up in a way that made Claire uncomfortable. One day, as Tanya refilled Claire's coffee, Claire overheard a man at the counter murmur, "She's got a pretty smile for someone like her." He said it with a forced politeness that made Claire's skin crawl. She wasn't sure if Tanya heard him, or if she was just so used to the casual cruelty that it didn't faze her anymore. The conversation shifted back to football and small-town gossip, but Claire could still hear the undertone of disdain in their voices. The regulars were comfortable with their words, comfortable in their own belief that their world was not for people like Tanya. Tanya caught Claire's eye as she placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of her. There was no smile this time, just a quiet acknowledgement of the discomfort that hung between them. "Some people don't know when to shut up," Tanya said, her voice even, but there was a slight edge to it. It was the first time Claire had heard Tanya speak with anything other than calm composure. Over the next few days, Claire returned to the diner more frequently. Each time, she paid closer attention. It was impossible to ignore how Tanya was treated by the regulars, how they looked at her, how they spoke to her with an undertone of superiority that Claire couldn't fully understand. Tanya moved with a kind of practiced detachment, as though she were trained to endure this kind of subtle cruelty. She greeted the regulars with a smile, served their food with efficiency, and kept her responses short. Claire began to feel a sense of unease in the pit of her stomach each time she entered. One morning, Claire watched as a man in his late 50s, clearly the oldest of the group, gave Tanya a slow once-over as she passed by. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her skin as though he were evaluating her worth, then muttered under his breath, "It's a shame, really. Such a nice place, ruined by, well, you know." His words were barely audible, but they were enough to make Claire's blood run cold. Tanya didn't flinch. She simply walked past the table as though she hadn't heard the words, but Claire saw the way her shoulders tensed. There was no outward sign of resistance, just an internal exhaustion that seemed to hang over Tanya like a heavy cloak. A few days later, Claire decided to ask the manager about the strange tension she'd been sensing. She had never been one to stay passive in uncomfortable situations, but she wasn't sure how to proceed here. The manager, a middle-aged man named Mr. Clark, was polite but distant. He had the look of someone who had spent too long behind a counter, someone who had learned to turn a blind eye to what went on around him. "Excuse me," Claire began, after catching Mr. Clark as he was wiping down the counter. "I couldn't help but notice the way, well, some of the customers speak to Tanya. Is that, normal?" Mr. Clark glanced over his shoulder, ensuring the customers weren't paying attention. His face, once kind, hardened into something unreadable. He shrugged. "Small town," he said nonchalantly. "People around here have been coming here for years. They've got their ways. You get used to it." Claire felt a cold pit form in her stomach. "But don't you think it's wrong?" Mr. Clark's expression didn't change. "No one's getting hurt. Tanya's tough. She knows how to handle it. Just stay out of it, all right?" Claire was taken aback. The indifference in his voice made her realize that what she had observed wasn't an anomaly. It was the norm. As the days passed, Claire's curiosity about Tanya deepened. She felt a strange pull to get to know her, to understand what Tanya had endured and how she had learned to survive in such an environment. Tanya, however, remained distant, her demeanor always professional, always polite. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet endurance that made Claire feel both inspired and helpless. One afternoon, as Claire finished her lunch, Tanya came over to clear the table. As she did, their eyes met for a brief moment. Tanya's face softened just slightly, and Claire could see a hint of vulnerability there. A side of Tanya she hadn't expected. "Thank you," Claire said quietly, unsure of what else to say. Tanya nodded, offering a small but genuine smile. "It's nothing," she said before turning back to her work. But to Claire, it felt like something. A glimpse into the woman behind the professional mask, a glimpse into the person Tanya was, beyond the walls of the diner and the judgments of the people around her. By the end of the week, Claire's discomfort had only grown. She couldn't ignore the way things were. The tension, the quiet cruelty, it was all becoming too much for her to bear. But every time she considered speaking up or confronting the issue, the weight of the social climate in the town made her second-guess herself. As she left the diner that evening, Claire looked back over her shoulder at Tanya, who was still moving through the room, serving, smiling, and enduring. She felt a heavy feeling in her chest, a question forming in her mind. How could she just walk away from all of this without doing something? That night, Claire sat at her small kitchen table, turning over the events of the day in her mind. The words of Mr. Clark echoed in her head. "You get used to it." She realized that, for most people in this town, this was just life. They had accepted it. But Claire couldn't, and she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was her upbringing, or the idealistic notion that things could be better. Whatever it was, she knew something had to change. She wasn't sure what she could do. After all, she was just one person. But the thought of standing by and letting this go on gnawed at her. She had to figure out how to act, how to speak up, and how to be a friend to someone who had likely never had one like her. That night, for the first time since she arrived, Claire made a vow to herself. She would not let this be the world she lived in. The next day, Claire returned to the diner. She hadn't planned to come back so soon, but something about the way the town felt now, the weight of its indifference, the palpable tension, made her uneasy. The diner seemed to be the only place where things felt unsettled in a way she couldn't ignore. It was as if everything else in town was just a facade, masking the rotting undercurrent that ran through the community. When she walked in, the bell above the door jingled, and the familiar clink of cutlery and quiet murmurs of conversation filled the air. The usual group of regulars occupied their spots at the counter, talking about the weather in clipped, disinterested tones. Claire sat at the same booth by the window, her eyes scanning the room. Tanya was behind the counter, her back to the customers as she refilled a coffee pot. When she turned around, her eyes met Claire's, and for the briefest of moments, there was a flicker of something. Maybe recognition, or maybe just the weight of what Claire had begun to understand about her world. "Back again," Tanya said, the words more neutral than friendly. "Yeah," Claire replied, forcing a smile, though her discomfort was growing. "Coffee again, please." Tanya nodded curtly and moved to fill the order. Claire watched her, noticing the slight weariness in her movements. Every so often, Tanya would glance at the regulars. None of them spoke to her directly, but Claire could see their eyes following her every move. It was like watching a deer in a field of wolves, graceful, but on constant alert. The next morning, Claire arrived a bit earlier than usual. The diner was quieter, and there were fewer patrons. She was determined to have a real conversation with Tanya this time, to learn something more. As Tanya moved toward her table, Claire didn't wait for her to speak. "Hey, Tanya," she said, her voice a little too loud in the quiet of the morning. "I've been thinking about things here, about how people treat you. I don't think it's right." Tanya paused, her hand still holding the coffee pot. Her face didn't show anger or surprise, but rather something closer to resignation. "Don't waste your energy on me," she said with a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine." Claire hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She felt as though her words were falling into a void. Tanya was standing there, but it was like she was already somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the reach of Claire's concern. "Is it really fine, though?" Claire pressed. "I mean, people talk to you like you're not even a person. Like you're invisible." Tanya's expression didn't change. She finished pouring the coffee into Claire's cup, her movements smooth but mechanical. "I've heard it all before," she said, avoiding Claire's eyes. "You get used to it. You don't let it bother you." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Tanya was already turning away, moving swiftly to serve another customer. There was something in the way Tanya carried herself, something that said she had learned to live with the hate, to keep her head down, to survive. Over the next few days, Claire kept coming back to the diner. The interactions between Tanya and the customers became more noticeable with each visit. Tanya seemed to have an innate ability to anticipate when someone might make a comment, and just before it was spoken, she would move, swiftly, silently, avoiding confrontation without showing any outward sign of distress. One afternoon, a particularly aggressive man, one who had been frequenting the diner for as long as Claire could remember, leaned toward Tanya as she refilled his coffee cup. "I don't know how you do it," he said in a voice low enough for only the two of them to hear. "Ain't you tired of being someone's servant?" Tanya's face didn't twitch. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. Her eyes remained fixed on the counter as she silently wiped it down. She didn't answer the question, didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. There was a brief, awkward silence before the man scoffed and turned to his companion. Tanya, however, remained as if nothing had happened. Claire, who had been watching from across the room, felt a sickening weight in her stomach. She could see it now. This wasn't just a quiet hostility. It was a constant barrage, a soft war that Tanya fought every day. But Claire didn't know what to do about it. By the end of the week, Claire had witnessed the environment in the diner deteriorate even further. The comments were no longer subtle or whispered. They were loud and unapologetic. One afternoon, Claire sat in her usual booth, sipping her coffee, when a man at the counter, a local farmer with a heavy accent, spoke up, his voice dripping with malice. "They think they can just walk in here, all high and mighty, like they own the place. Makes me sick, really. That girl, she should know her place." The comment hung in the air, thick with venom. Tanya, who had been clearing a nearby table, didn't look up. She kept walking, the stiff set of her shoulders the only indication that the words had landed where they were meant to. Another customer joined in. "She probably thinks she's better than us," he said, his tone laced with mockery. "Can't even understand why they let someone like her work here. She should be at home, where she belongs." Claire's heart pounded. She didn't know what to do with the anger that flared inside her. She watched Tanya, but the woman's face was like stone. No flicker of emotion, no sign that the words had affected her. Claire was about to say something, anything, to stop the verbal assault, but Tanya was already back behind the counter, her back turned to the group. She wasn't just avoiding conflict. She was erasing herself from the situation entirely. That evening, as Claire walked through the streets, her mind was racing. The words of the customers at the diner echoed in her ears, but what disturbed her more than their blatant cruelty was the complete indifference of the town around her. It wasn't just the diner. It was the entire town. She passed by a group of teenagers outside a local store, laughing loudly. As she neared, she heard one of them say, "She's just like the rest of them. Should have never let her stay. Probably thinks she's special." Claire quickened her pace, feeling the sting of the words as though they were meant for her. They weren't, of course. They were meant for Tanya, but the weight of them was the same. She stopped at a bench, sitting down to gather her thoughts. The town, this town she had moved to, was soaked in something she hadn't fully realized before. It was like a disease that had infected everyone, one that they all seemed to carry without questioning it. They were all complicit in the way they treated people like Tanya, the way they refused to see her as human. As Claire sat there, the realization hit her like a hammer. She couldn't just sit by anymore. She couldn't ignore this. She had to do something. That evening, Claire tried to talk to her roommate, Emily, about what had been happening. She needed someone to talk to, someone to help her process all the feelings of anger, confusion, and guilt she was carrying. "You've noticed it, right?" Claire asked, her voice a little too sharp. "The way Tanya's treated, the way people talk about her." Emily looked up from her book, her brow furrowing. "I mean, yeah, I guess. People around here are different. You know that. It's just how things are. I don't think it's worth making a big deal out of." Claire's frustration mounted. "It's not just how things are, Emily. It's wrong. People shouldn't be treated like that. She shouldn't be treated like that." Emily shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "I don't know, Claire. I don't think it's really our place to." As she left the diner that evening, Claire looked back over her shoulder at Tanya, who was still moving through the room, serving, smiling, and enduring. She felt a heavy feeling in her chest, a question forming in her mind. How could she just walk away from all of this without doing something? That night, Claire sat at her small kitchen table, turning over the events of the day in her mind. The words of Mr. Clark echoed in her head. You get used to it. She realized that, for most people in this town, this was just life. They had accepted it. But Claire couldn't, and she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was her upbringing, or the idealistic notion that things could be better. Whatever it was, she knew something had to change. She wasn't sure what she could do. After all, she was just one person. But the thought of standing by and letting this go on gnawed at her. She had to figure out how to act, how to speak up, and how to be a friend to someone who had likely never had one like her. That night, for the first time since she arrived, Claire made a vow to herself. She would not let this be the world she lived in. The next day, Claire returned to the diner. She hadn't planned to come back so soon, but something about the way the town felt now, the weight of its indifference, the palpable tension, made her uneasy. The diner seemed to be the only place where things felt unsettled in a way she couldn't ignore. It was as if everything else in town was just a facade, masking the rotting undercurrent that ran through the community. When she walked in, the bell above the door jingled, and the familiar clink of cutlery and quiet murmurs of conversation filled the air. The usual group of regulars occupied their spots at the counter, talking about the weather in clipped, disinterested tones. Claire sat at the same booth by the window, her eyes scanning the room. Tanya was behind the counter, her back to the customers as she refilled a coffee pot. When she turned around, her eyes met Claire's, and for the briefest of moments, there was a flicker of something. Maybe recognition, or maybe just the weight of what Claire had begun to understand about her world. "Back again," Tanya said, the words more neutral than friendly. "Yeah," Claire replied, forcing a smile, though her discomfort was growing. "Coffee again, please." Tanya nodded curtly and moved to fill the order. Claire watched her, noticing the slight weariness in her movements. Every so often, Tanya would glance at the regulars. None of them spoke to her directly, but Claire could see their eyes following her every move. It was like watching a deer in a field of wolves, graceful, but on constant alert. The next morning, Claire arrived a bit earlier than usual. The diner was quieter, and there were fewer patrons. She was determined to have a real conversation with Tanya this time, to learn something more. As Tanya moved toward her table, Claire didn't wait for her to speak. "Hey, Tanya," she said, her voice a little too loud in the quiet of the morning. "I've been thinking about things here, about how people treat you. I don't think it's right." Tanya paused, her hand still holding the coffee pot. Her face didn't show anger or surprise, but rather something closer to resignation. "Don't waste your energy on me," she said with a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine." Claire hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She felt as though her words were falling into a void. Tanya was standing there, but it was like she was already somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the reach of Claire's concern. "Is it really fine, though?" Claire pressed. "I mean, people talk to you like you're not even a person. Like you're invisible." Tanya's expression didn't change. She finished pouring the coffee into Claire's cup, her movements smooth but mechanical. "I've heard it all before," she said, avoiding Claire's eyes. "You get used to it. You don't let it bother you." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Tanya was already turning away, moving swiftly to serve another customer. There was something in the way Tanya carried herself, something that said she had learned to live with the hate, to keep her head down, to survive. Over the next few days, Claire kept coming back to the diner. The interactions between Tanya and the customers became more noticeable with each visit. Tanya seemed to have an innate ability to anticipate when someone might make a comment, and just before it was spoken, she would move, swiftly, silently, avoiding confrontation without showing any outward sign of distress. One afternoon, a particularly aggressive man, one who had been frequenting the diner for as long as Claire could remember, leaned toward Tanya as she refilled his coffee cup. "I don't know how you do it," he said in a voice low enough for only the two of them to hear. "Ain't you tired of being someone's servant?" Tanya's face didn't twitch. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. Her eyes remained fixed on the counter as she silently wiped it down. She didn't answer the question, didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. There was a brief, awkward silence before the man scoffed and turned to his companion. Tanya, however, remained as if nothing had happened. Claire, who had been watching from across the room, felt a sickening weight in her stomach. She could see it now. This wasn't just a quiet hostility. It was a constant barrage, a soft war that Tanya fought every day. But Claire didn't know what to do about it. By the end of the week, Claire had witnessed the environment in the diner deteriorate even further. The comments were no longer subtle or whispered. They were loud and unapologetic. One afternoon, Claire sat in her usual booth, sipping her coffee, when a man at the counter, a local farmer with a heavy accent, spoke up, his voice dripping with malice. "They think they can just walk in here, all high and mighty, like they own the place. Makes me sick, really. That girl, she should know her place." The comment hung in the air, thick with venom. Tanya, who had been clearing a nearby table, didn't look up. She kept walking, the stiff set of her shoulders the only indication that the words had landed where they were meant to. Another customer joined in. "She probably thinks she's better than us," he said, his tone laced with mockery. "Can't even understand why they let someone like her work here. She should be at home, where she belongs." Claire's heart pounded. She didn't know what to do with the anger that flared inside her. She watched Tanya, but the woman's face was like stone. No flicker of emotion, no sign that the words had affected her. Claire was about to say something, anything, to stop the verbal assault, but Tanya was already back behind the counter, her back turned to the group. She wasn't just avoiding conflict. She was erasing herself from the situation entirely. That evening, as Claire walked through the streets, her mind was racing. The words of the customers at the diner echoed in her ears, but what disturbed her more than their blatant cruelty was the complete indifference of the town around her. It wasn't just the diner. It was the entire town. She passed by a group of teenagers outside a local store, laughing loudly. As she neared, she heard one of them say, "She's just like the rest of them. Should have never let her stay. Probably thinks she's special." Claire quickened her pace, feeling the sting of the words as though they were meant for her. They weren't, of course. They were meant for Tanya, but the weight of them was the same. She stopped at a bench, sitting down to gather her thoughts. The town, this town she had moved to, was soaked in something she hadn't fully realized before. It was like a disease that had infected everyone, one that they all seemed to carry without questioning it. They were all complicit in the way they treated people like Tanya, the way they refused to see her as human. As Claire sat there, the realization hit her like a hammer. She couldn't just sit by anymore. She couldn't ignore this. She had to do something. That evening, Claire tried to talk to her roommate, Emily, about what had been happening. She needed someone to talk to, someone to help her process all the feelings of anger, confusion, and guilt she was carrying. "You've noticed it, right?" Claire asked, her voice a little too sharp. "The way Tanya's treated, the way people talk about her." Emily looked up from her book, her brow furrowing. "I mean, yeah, I guess. People around here are different. You know that. It's just how things are. I don't think it's worth making a big deal out of." Claire's frustration mounted. "It's not just how things are, Emily. It's wrong. People shouldn't be treated like that. She shouldn't be treated like that." Emily shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "I don't know, Claire. I don't think it's really our place to." "Of course it's our place." Claire cut her off, her voice rising slightly. "You can't just ignore it because it's uncomfortable. We're supposed to be better than this." Emily's expression hardened, and she looked away. "Look, I get it. You're upset. But it's not our fight. We're just here to work, to live our lives. You can't change the whole town." Claire stared at her, her heart sinking. "Maybe not, but I can try." The next morning, Claire returned to the diner, her resolve clear. As she walked in, Tanya was busy at the counter, and once again, the regulars were muttering under their breath. Claire was about to take her seat when Tanya caught her eye. This time, Tanya's gaze wasn't guarded. For the first time since Claire had come to the diner, she saw a flicker of something more human in Tanya's eyes, a weariness, but also a quiet acknowledgement. Without a word, Tanya walked over and set down a coffee cup in front of Claire. There was no smile, but there was an understanding between them, unspoken, but undeniable. "I'm not going to let them do this to you," Claire said quietly, her voice steady now, no longer unsure. Tanya nodded, her expression unreadable, but for a brief moment, she didn't look like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Instead, she looked like someone who had just found a moment of peace. That night, after her conversation with Emily, Claire knew what she had to do. She couldn't stay silent any longer. She wasn't just passing through this town. She was part of it now. And this town wasn't going to change if people like her didn't speak up. The next morning, Claire decided she would confront the customers, confront the town's cruelty head-on. She wasn't sure what that meant yet, whether it would be a big public stand or just quiet acts of defiance. But she was certain of one thing. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. As she looked at Tanya across the diner, she made a vow to herself, one she didn't fully understand yet, but felt deep in her bones. No more silent complicity. Claire woke up with a sense of resolve the next morning. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the world outside was still dark, but in her heart, she felt like a weight had been lifted. She had made her decision. That morning at the diner, as usual, the regulars were settled in their spots, discussing everything from the weather to their farm work, all while occasionally glancing at Tanya, whose presence they seemed to regard with disdain. Claire entered, greeted by the usual jingle of the doorbell. She made her way to her booth by the window. Tanya was behind the counter, pouring coffee, her back turned to the crowd. But Claire didn't hesitate. She couldn't. As Tanya passed by, Claire caught her eye. "Tanya," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Tanya paused, looking at her with an unreadable expression. "Sure, what's up?" She set her coffee pot down with a small clink. Claire hesitated for just a moment, but then she pushed forward. "I can't just sit by anymore. I see the way they treat you, the things they say, and I'm not okay with it. I don't want to ignore it anymore. I don't think anyone should be treated like that." Tanya's expression was guarded, but Claire noticed the brief flicker of surprise in her eyes. "You don't have to do anything," Tanya replied, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not your fight." "No," Claire said, her voice growing a little more passionate. "It is my fight. Because it's not just about you, Tanya. It's about all of us. We all have to live here. And I can't keep pretending like it's okay." There was a long silence between them. Claire could see the walls Tanya had built around herself, the armor she wore to protect her from the cruelty around her. But Claire wasn't backing down. Not this time. Tanya let out a small sigh, her shoulders slumping just a little. "You really don't know what you're getting into, do you?" Claire shook her head. "I'm not sure. But I can't just ignore it anymore." Tanya studied her for a moment, and then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "All right," she said softly, "but don't expect it to be easy." Claire smiled faintly, a sense of determination rising in her chest. "I'm ready for it." As Claire settled into her booth, she couldn't help but notice the group of regulars sitting at the counter. It felt like all of their eyes were on her now, like they knew something was about to shift, and she was sure they did. The air in the diner felt thick, charged with tension. Tanya moved through the room with her usual grace, silently attending to the regulars, filling their cups and placing their orders. But Claire could feel the undercurrent of hostility growing, and she wasn't going to let it slide this time. The man who had been particularly vocal about his disdain for Tanya, the farmer with the thick accent, looked at her from across the counter, his eyes narrowing as he leaned toward the man sitting next to him. "You know," he began in a loud voice that could easily be overheard, "I don't understand how someone like her can just walk around here, like she's got the same rights as the rest of us." Claire's pulse quickened. She took a deep breath, stood up, and walked to the counter, her feet solid beneath her. Her heart was pounding, but she couldn't back down now. Not after everything she had seen. "Excuse me," Claire said, her voice steady, though there was a noticeable edge to it. "I couldn't help but overhear what you just said, and I just want to make it clear that what you're saying is wrong." The diner grew silent, the conversations from other tables halting as everyone turned to look at her. Tanya stopped in her tracks, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean, wrong?" the farmer asked, his voice sharp with disdain. He wasn't used to being called out, and it showed. "We're just saying what everyone's thinking." Claire wasn't fazed. She looked at him directly. "No, you're not. You're spreading hate. You're dehumanizing someone just because of the color of her skin, and that's wrong. It's always been wrong." The farmer's face reddened with anger, but he didn't say anything. Instead, the man next to him, another regular, spoke up. "Who do you think you are, coming in here and telling us how to think?" he said, his voice thick with contempt. "This is our town, and we've been here for years. You don't just waltz in and start changing everything." The anger in Claire's chest flared, but she didn't back down. "I'm not trying to change everything. I'm just saying that people should be treated with respect. Everyone, especially Tanya." Tanya, who had been standing behind the counter, now looked at Claire, her face unreadable. The silence that stretched between them was thick, almost suffocating. But Claire didn't look away. She knew she couldn't back down now. She'd started something, and she had to see it through. As expected, the backlash came swiftly. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the diner grew increasingly hostile. The regulars, emboldened by their long-standing dominance over the space, began to make their dislike of Claire very clear. Claire had come in that morning, hoping things might settle down, but it was worse than ever. The usual group of men at the counter made sure to look her way every time she entered, shooting her cold, hostile glares. The insults weren't overt. There was a certain subtlety to them, but Claire could feel the daggers they threw her way every time she stepped foot inside the diner. The farmer, in particular, seemed to take personal offense to Claire's stand. "What's this world coming to?" he muttered loudly as Claire sat down in her booth. The words meant for her ears alone. People like her, sticking their noses where they don't belong. Claire refused to look away, her gaze steady as she sat down. But it was clear that the situation was escalating. The tension between the regulars and Claire was palpable. The discomfort of those around her was growing, and Claire could sense that the town was beginning to take sides. But Tanya remained a silent observer. She continued to work as she always did, polite, efficient, but distant. It was clear that Tanya had dealt with this kind of behavior for a long time, and she wasn't surprised by the way people were reacting. The only difference now was that Claire had shown up, and Tanya wasn't sure how to feel about it. One evening, after a particularly intense confrontation with one of the regulars, Claire walked out of the diner with her heart heavy. She had stood her ground, but it felt like the town was pushing back harder than ever. She could hear the whispers as she left, the judgment in the air as thick as the humidity. Walking down the sidewalk, Claire found herself feeling defeated. She had come to this town hoping to make a difference, to fight against the undercurrent of racism she had witnessed. But now, she was beginning to doubt whether she had the strength to keep going. What was the point? She wondered. The town was so deeply entrenched in its hatred and apathy. The backlash wasn't just from the regulars, it was from everyone. People would stare at her in the street, whisper behind their hands. She was tired, and for the first time, she thought about leaving. Maybe it would be easier to walk away, to let the town continue its slow, poisonous march. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew she couldn't. She couldn't walk away from this, from Tanya, from the injustice that she was now so deeply entwined with. Claire stood still on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath. She would not give in. Not now. Not after everything she had seen. Later that night, Claire returned to the diner, determined to speak with Tanya once more. She found her at the counter, wiping down the surface, her back still turned to the rest of the room. Claire approached cautiously, her footsteps soft. "Tanya," she said quietly. Tanya looked up, her face betraying little emotion. "You're still here, huh?" Claire nodded. "I can't just leave. I'm not giving up on you. On this." Tanya didn't speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was softer than Claire had ever heard it. "You don't know what you're getting into. You don't know what it's like to live with this every day, to face it down with a smile on your face, to keep going even when it feels like the world is against you." Claire stepped closer. "I might not understand what it's like to live it, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Tanya looked at her for a long time. Then, for the first time, she smiled, a small, tired smile. "I don't know if that makes you brave or foolish, but thank you." Claire returned her smile, the bond between them growing stronger in the quiet moment. She wasn't alone in this anymore. The next day, as Claire entered the diner, something was different. The tension was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it felt quieter. The regulars didn't speak as loudly, didn't look at her with the same venom they had before. It was subtle, but it was something. Something had shifted. Claire sat at her usual booth, her eyes meeting Tanya's across the room. There was a new sense of understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement that this wasn't over, but that it was worth fighting for. Tanya nodded, and Claire returned the gesture, knowing that this was just the beginning. The weeks following Claire's confrontation with the regulars had been a slow burn of discomfort. There was a noticeable shift in the air every time Claire walked into the diner. The tension between her and the townspeople had escalated, but there were still moments of quiet, tentative progress. The people of the town were divided, and that was becoming evident everywhere Claire went. The streets felt colder, and the faces that had once been warm or indifferent now felt harder, more judgmental. Whispers followed her wherever she walked. Conversations halted when she entered a room. Claire was becoming a symbol, whether she liked it or not, of change. One afternoon, as Claire stepped out of the diner, she heard a low murmur behind her. Two women, sitting at a nearby bench, watched her pass. Claire tried to ignore them, but their conversation was unmistakably clear. "It's dangerous, you know," one woman said in a hushed tone, though loud enough for Claire to hear. "People like her don't belong here. Stirring things up. It'll never end well." The other woman nodded, looking over at Claire with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "She'll learn. They always do." Claire's jaw tightened, but she didn't stop. She couldn't show weakness now. The stakes were too high, and she knew the town was watching her every move. The more she defied their expectations, the more they resisted. Inside the diner, Tanya was working harder than ever, though her exhaustion was beginning to show. Her movements were mechanical, no longer fluid and effortless like they once were. The weight of the world, of the hostility around her, seemed to be bearing down on her more and more. But she was used to it. Tanya had learned long ago that survival was about ignoring the pain, pushing it down, and getting through the day. But Claire noticed. One evening, Claire arrived a little later than usual and saw Tanya standing behind the counter, staring blankly out the window. Her hands were still, the coffee pot forgotten in her grasp. Her face was unreadable, but Claire could see the exhaustion etched into every line. Tanya had always been good at hiding her emotions, but there was no mistaking the way she looked now. She was tired, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Claire approached cautiously, not wanting to intrude, but unable to ignore the silent cry for help. "Tanya," she said softly, "you okay?" Tanya blinked, slowly coming back to the present, though her gaze was still distant. She smiled faintly, though it was the kind of smile that only existed out of habit. "I'm fine," Tanya said, but Claire could hear the lie in her voice. It was too thin, too fragile. Claire stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You don't have to pretend, you know. I see it. I see you." For the first time in a long while, Tanya let her guard slip. She sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping as she set the coffee pot down. She looked at Claire, really looked at her, her eyes searching, vulnerable. "I'm so tired, Claire. I don't know how much longer I can do this." Claire's heart broke, and without thinking, she reached out, placing a gentle hand on Tanya's shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone. You've been carrying this for so long. Let me help you." Tanya didn't pull away. For a brief moment, the weight seemed to lift, if only a little. "It's not just the work," Tanya whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It's everything. It's the way people look at me. It's the things they say when they think I'm not listening. It's the way they talk to me, like I'm invisible. It's the way they pretend nothing's wrong, like everything's just fine." Claire squeezed her shoulder, her voice steady. "I'm not going to let them keep doing this. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here with you." Tanya looked at her for a long time, a mix of skepticism and gratitude in her gaze. "You think you can change this town?" she asked quietly. Claire nodded. "I think I have to try." Later that night, Claire sat at her kitchen table, a notebook in front of her, scribbling down ideas. Her frustration was growing, but so was her resolve. She knew she couldn't just keep showing up at the diner and hoping things would change on their own. She had to do more. Something louder, something that couldn't be ignored. She started making a list. Speak to the local church leaders. They were often the moral compass of the town. If she could get them on her side, maybe she could shift the town's mentality. Organize a community meeting. Bring the issues to light in a safe space. Let people talk about the problem. Claire knew that exposing the town's racism wasn't going to be easy, but it was a necessary step. She couldn't stand idly by and let it continue. Support Tanya. Above all, She had to make sure Tanya didn't feel alone in this. Tanya had been shouldering the weight of the town's hatred for so long. It was time to help her bear it. Claire's heart was pounding as she wrote. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. This was her fight now, and she wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. She wasn't going to stand by and watch this community suffocate under its own prejudice. The next Sunday, Claire took a deep breath and walked into the local church. It was the first step in her plan. She'd met with Pastor Grace the week before, and while the older woman had been skeptical at first, Claire had managed to convince her that there was a real problem in the town, one that needed to be addressed. The church was packed with familiar faces, some of whom Claire had known for years. The pews were filled with the kind of people who had either ignored the town's racial tension or quietly accepted it. It was time to change that. As the sermon ended, Pastor Grace stood up, her presence commanding the room. She paused for a moment, letting the silence settle before she spoke. "I want to bring something to your attention today," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There are some things happening in our town that we need to address, things that we can no longer ignore. We are called, as a community, to be better, to love our neighbors as ourselves. But are we truly living that out?" The congregation was quiet, but Claire could feel the energy shift. Eyes were on her, and she felt the weight of every glance. She had no idea if this would work, if the town would even listen, but she had to try. "We're going to have a meeting this week," Pastor Grace continued. "A chance for us to come together, to talk about what's happening here, to listen to each other, and to find a way forward." There was a low murmur among the crowd. Some faces were confused, others uncomfortable. But Claire could see the flicker of hope in the eyes of a few people who, like her, wanted change but had been too afraid to take a stand. As the service ended and the congregation began to file out, Claire approached Pastor Grace. "Thank you," she said quietly. Pastor Grace smiled at her. "We'll see if anyone shows up, but I think you've planted a seed." The community meeting was scheduled for that Wednesday evening, but Claire had already felt the backlash starting. Whispers were already circulating, and the regulars at the diner had been vocal in their opposition. Tanya had heard the rumors as well. "People are already talking about the meeting," she said, wiping down the counter. "They're calling it a troublemaking session." Her voice was flat, but there was an edge to it, an undercurrent of something Claire couldn't quite place. "They'll try to shut it down," Claire said, her jaw set. "But that's why we have to show up. It's the only way to make it stop." Tanya's eyes met hers. "You really think they'll listen?" Claire paused for a moment. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But if we don't try, things will never change." Tanya looked at her, a mixture of hope and uncertainty in her expression. "Maybe. But just be careful, okay?" Claire smiled. "I will. I promise." Wednesday night arrived, and Claire's heart was pounding in her chest. The meeting was being held in the church's small community hall, a modest space that could hold about 50 people. She didn't expect a large turnout, but she hoped for the best. As Claire entered the hall, she was surprised to find that the room was half full. People had actually shown up. Some of the older members of the congregation, a few of the younger families, and even a couple of people from the diner. Tanya was there, though she had arrived late and seemed to hang back at the edges of the room, unsure. Pastor Grace stood at the front, ready to begin. Claire's heart swelled. This was it. The town's future was beginning to unfold, and it was in this room, with people who had come together, however hesitantly, to make a change. The meeting at the church had gone better than Claire could have hoped, but the fallout was swift. The tension that had been simmering for weeks now erupted into open conflict. The town, it seemed, was more divided than ever. In the days following the meeting, rumors spread like wildfire. The people who had attended were now labeled troublemakers, outsiders, or worse. The lines between those who wanted change and those who wanted to maintain the status quo had been drawn clearly. The whispers Claire had overheard weeks ago had turned into open hostility. At the diner, the regulars took their discomfort to another level. The farmer Claire had confronted earlier now made a point of openly mocking her whenever she entered, calling her the town's hero with heavy sarcasm, making sure his words were loud enough for everyone to hear. One afternoon, as Claire sat down in her usual booth, she overheard him speaking to the man sitting next to him. This town's been fine for years, and now all of a sudden, we've got outsiders trying to tell us how to run things. It's a damn shame. Claire met his gaze, but she didn't respond. She could feel the heat of his words like a weight on her chest, but she didn't back down. Not now. Not when it felt like everything she was fighting for was hanging by a thread. But it wasn't just the regulars. As Claire walked down the street later that day, she noticed more people giving her cold looks or whispering when she passed by. Even a few of the town's shopkeepers seemed to be giving her the silent treatment. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, scrutinized, as if her every move was a test. That evening, Claire met with Pastor Grace in her office at the church. They sat across from each other, a pile of pamphlets and notes between them, but neither of them was looking at the papers. The conversation was tense, but there was a quiet understanding in the air. We're making some progress, but it feels like the ground is shifting under our feet, Claire said, running a hand through her hair. The backlash is worse than I expected. I didn't think it would hit this hard. Pastor Grace nodded, her expression weary but resolute. You've opened a door, Claire, but that door is dangerous for a lot of people. Not just for you, but for those who stand with you. People here have lived with these divisions for generations. Change isn't something they want. It's something they fear. I know, Claire said, her voice steady, but it's the right thing. I can't just stand by and let things stay the way they are. Pastor Grace leaned back in her chair, studying Claire closely. You're a good person, Claire, but there's more at stake now than just the truth. People are angry, and when people are angry, they don't see reason. They act out of fear. Claire's chest tightened. I can't let that stop me. Pastor Grace's gaze softened, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. I don't want to see you hurt, but I fear that's where this is headed. The town's hostility reached its peak the following weekend. Claire arrived at the diner to find the door locked, a sign posted on the window, closed for the day. She stood there for a moment, bewildered, before Tanya appeared at the door. I didn't know what else to do, Tanya said quietly, opening the door to let Claire inside. They said if I didn't close up, they'd boycott the place. They're already spreading rumors, saying I'm causing trouble by serving you. Claire felt a pang of guilt in her chest, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't her fault. This was a reaction to the fear and hatred that had existed in this town for far too long. I'm so sorry, Claire said, but Tanya shook her head. No, it's not you, Claire. It's me. I've been here long enough to know how these things go. They're not mad at you. They're mad at the idea of change. They're mad that I'm still here, serving food, just like everyone else. Claire looked around the diner. The place was empty, cold. It felt wrong, like it had lost its soul. Tanya had made it a home, a safe space for the people who could see beyond the town's walls. And now, it was a battleground. This can't keep going on, Claire said, her voice hardening. We can't let them win like this. Tanya looked at her, a quiet sadness in her eyes. I don't know if I can do this anymore. It's hard enough just to survive here. I can't keep fighting this fight alone. Claire's heart broke for her. But this wasn't the time to give up. You don't have to fight alone, she said. You're not alone in this. I'm here. We're here. Later that evening, Claire was walking home when she saw someone standing near the town square. A familiar face, but one she hadn't seen in a while. It was Emily, the young woman from the church who had attended the meeting. She had always been quiet, kept to herself, but something about the way she was standing, eyes fixed on the ground, her posture tense, made Claire stop. Emily? Claire called out, approaching her slowly. Emily looked up, startled, before her gaze softened. Oh, hi, Claire. You okay? Claire asked, her voice gentle. Emily nodded, though there was a weight in her expression that told Claire everything she needed to know. I've been thinking about what you said at the meeting, about the town, about what we're doing here. And I don't know. I guess I thought things would be different. But people are starting to turn on me too. Claire's heart sank. Emily was young, only 18, and she hadn't been prepared for the hostility that came with standing up for what was right. It was one thing to want change, but another to bear the brunt of the anger that followed. "You don't have to do this alone," Claire said quietly. "You have me, and Pastor Grace. You don't have to stand in the middle of this fight by yourself." Emily smiled faintly. "I know. I just didn't expect things to get so ugly, you know? I thought people would listen, but they're not." Claire put a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Change is hard. It takes time, but we're not backing down, okay?" Emily's eyes brightened, and for the first time, Claire saw a glimmer of hope in her expression. "Okay," Emily said. "I'll keep fighting, if you will." The following week, Claire and Emily decided to organize a peaceful protest. It wasn't going to be a large one, just a small gathering in front of the diner, a chance to show the town that there were people who believed in change. They handed out flyers, invited anyone they thought might be willing to join. Tanya, hesitant at first, agreed to be there. The morning of the protest, Claire arrived early to set up. She was nervous. Her palms were sweating, her stomach twisted with anticipation. Would anyone show up? Or would it just be her, standing there alone? As the clock ticked closer to noon, the first few people arrived. Slowly, more showed up. It wasn't a crowd, but it was a start. People who had been silent for too long were finally beginning to speak up. Tanya arrived last, looking unsure but determined. She stood by Claire, her eyes scanning the crowd. But Claire could see that there was something different in the way she carried herself today. She was no longer just surviving. She was standing with her head held high, ready to face whatever came next. The protest was quiet but powerful. People held signs, spoke with one another, and, most importantly, showed that there was another side to the town. The other side of fear, the side of hope, and the belief that change was possible. The aftermath of the protest was predictable. In the days following, the town's resistance grew louder and more hostile. The town council met in secret, planning ways to discourage any further demonstrations. Claire was followed, watched, and sometimes harassed. Rumors circulated that the protest was a dangerous gathering, that it had turned the town's already fragile harmony into chaos. At the diner, the regulars continued their campaign of harassment. They whispered loudly whenever Claire entered, making her feel like a stranger in a place she had once considered home. Tanya remained quiet, her eyes flickering to Claire every now and then, but she was learning not to react, learning how to withstand the pressure. But Claire wasn't backing down. No matter how hard they tried to push her away, she wouldn't leave. This was her fight, and she had no intention of losing. The days following the protest had been tense. Claire felt the town's animosity toward her grow sharper with each passing moment. The whispers and stares had turned into open hostility, and she knew she couldn't avoid the inevitable. The town would have to choose a side. The diner had become a battleground, where the lines between friends and enemies were drawn so sharply that it was hard to tell where the animosity began and the loyalty ended. Tanya, though still steadfast, seemed increasingly withdrawn, weary of the tension. Claire understood. The constant pressure was beginning to take its toll on everyone. One afternoon, Claire arrived at the diner to find Tanya standing behind the counter, her back straight, but her eyes clouded with fatigue. She greeted Claire with a tight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Everything okay?" Claire asked, sitting down in her usual booth. Tanya gave a short nod. "I'm fine, just tired." But Claire could see the way Tanya's hands shook slightly as she wiped down the counter. The stress was beginning to crack the resilience Tanya had always carried with quiet strength. Before Claire could say anything else, a familiar voice interrupted. It was Frank, one of the more vocal regulars, his face twisted with contempt. "Don't know what you're trying to prove, Claire. You and your little band of troublemakers," Frank sneered. "You think you're helping this place, but you're tearing it apart. Just look around you. People don't want your kind here. You're wasting your time." The words stung, but Claire refused to flinch. She had learned long ago that reacting was what they wanted. Reacting would give them power. So instead, she kept her voice calm, even as her hands clenched into fists. "I'm not here to prove anything to you, Frank. I'm here to make sure people like Tanya have a place where they're treated with respect. And if that bothers you, Maybe you should look in the mirror. Tanya's eyes flicked to Claire, a flicker of something in them. Hope, perhaps, or the smallest bit of gratitude. But she said nothing. Frank, however, wasn't finished. I'm not the problem here, Frank barked, leaning in toward Claire. You people like to come here and stir up trouble, pretending like everything's wrong when it's just fine. But you wouldn't know that, would you? You don't belong here. A long silence followed as the other patrons in the diner shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her gaze steady. There was no use in continuing this conversation with someone who wouldn't listen. Instead, she stood up, her chair scraping across the floor. You know, Frank, you might be right. Maybe I don't belong here. But I do know that people like Tanya deserve better than this. And I'm going to fight for her, whether you like it or not. With that, Claire left the diner, her steps resolute, though her chest felt heavy. The following day, Claire received an unexpected summons. The town council had scheduled an emergency meeting, and her name was on the agenda. Word had spread that her efforts to organize protests and challenge the status quo were not sitting well with the town's leadership. This was not just about her anymore. This was about the future of the town itself. Claire knew the meeting could get ugly. She could already feel the tension in the air as she entered the small town hall. The room was filled with the usual faces, old-timers who had lived in the town their whole lives, their faces hard and set in judgment. The council members sat at the front, stern expressions on their faces, waiting for her to take a seat. As she walked to the front of the room, the eyes of the town were on her, sharp, accusatory. The murmurs had already started. She could hear snippets of conversation. She thinks she can change us. She's making things worse. When she reached the front, Mayor Douglas, a portly man with a deep, gravelly voice, cleared his throat. Claire, he began, his tone dripping with condescension, we've called this meeting because your actions have raised serious concerns about the stability and well-being of our community. It's no secret that your activism has caused division among the townspeople. We believe it's best for everyone if you stop trying to stir up unnecessary conflict. Claire stood tall, her heart pounding, but her voice unwavering. I'm not here to divide this town, Mayor. I'm here because people like Tanya deserve dignity, respect, and a fair chance to live their lives without being treated like second-class citizens. And I won't apologize for standing up for that. A few members of the council exchanged uneasy glances, but the mayor pressed on. This town has been built on a certain way of life. We don't need outsiders telling us what's right for us. You're causing damage, Claire, and if you continue this campaign, we may have to take further action. Claire's eyes narrowed. What kind of action are we talking about, Mayor? What's your solution? Silencing people who disagree with you? You'll find out soon enough if you keep pushing us, the mayor replied curtly, signaling to the others to end the meeting. Claire didn't leave immediately. She stood there, looking out at the council, her hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't afraid, but the reality of what she was up against was now painfully clear. This wasn't just about changing minds. It was about breaking down walls that had been built over generations. As she turned and walked out of the meeting, she felt the weight of the entire town pressing down on her. It wasn't just Tanya's future that was at stake anymore. It was everyone's. Later that evening, Tanya showed up at Claire's apartment unannounced. She hadn't called, but Claire wasn't surprised. Tanya had always been a quiet presence, but Claire knew when something was weighing heavily on her. Tonight, it was clear that Tanya was carrying a lot more than usual. I heard about the meeting, Tanya said quietly as she stepped inside, her eyes avoiding Claire's gaze. It's getting worse, isn't it? Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to Tanya. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, but Claire knew Tanya needed to speak her truth, just as she needed to speak hers. I don't know how much longer I can do this, Tanya admitted after a long silence. People are turning on me. My family's upset with me. They don't understand why I keep working here, why I'm still in this town, putting myself through all of this. I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep fighting. Claire's heart ached for her. Tanya had already lived through so much pain, And now it seemed like that pain was being dragged back to the surface. Claire reached out, placing a hand on Tanya's arm. "You were strong enough, Tanya. You've been strong your whole life. And I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens next, we're in this together." Tanya looked at her then, her eyes wet with emotion, and for the first time in a long while, Claire saw a flicker of hope. The weight of the world seemed to lift, just slightly, as Tanya gave a small, hesitant smile. "I don't know what's going to happen," Tanya said, voice trembling, "but I'm not going to let them break me. Not again." Claire squeezed her hand. "And I'm not going to let them break you either. We'll figure this out. Together." Despite the rising tension, Claire and Tanya's bond grew stronger with each passing day. But the town's resistance was relentless, and the pressure continued to mount. As Claire prepared for another protest, this time larger and more organized, she knew that this would be the turning point. The town would either bend or break under the weight of its own hatred and fear. Claire had seen the worst of what the town could do, but she also knew that the only way to move forward was through confrontation, through showing the town that their divisions wouldn't be ignored any longer. She was ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant making enemies in the process. But as she and Tanya stood together, preparing for the protest, they both knew one thing. This was no longer just a fight for equality. It was a fight for the soul of the town itself, and it was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. The day of the largest protest yet had arrived. Claire and Tanya stood together in front of the diner early that morning, watching as people trickled into the small town square. They had worked tirelessly for weeks, organizing, planning, gathering support. Flyers were posted on every corner, and word had spread far beyond the town's usual circle. This time, they weren't just hoping for a small turnout. They needed the town to hear them, loud and clear. Despite the mounting tension, the day felt strangely peaceful. The sun was high in the sky, casting its warm glow over the small town, and for a brief moment, Claire allowed herself to breathe. The streets weren't yet filled with protesters, but there was a quiet determination in the air, the kind that only came when people were willing to put everything on the line for something bigger than themselves. Tanya stood beside her, looking out at the crowd as they gathered. There was a mix of familiar faces, some of the people who had supported her in the past, and a few new ones, hesitant but hopeful. Claire noticed a few people who had been vocal in their opposition to the protests in the past, their expressions tight with uncertainty. Change was never easy, and it seemed like even those who resisted couldn't ignore it anymore. "You ready?" Claire asked Tanya, her voice soft but steady. Tanya nodded, but her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the sign she was holding. It was a simple message: everyone deserves respect. "I'm not sure I'll ever feel ready," Tanya replied quietly, "but I'm here. And that's all I can do right now." Claire smiled. "That's more than enough." As more people gathered in the square, Claire caught sight of Emily, the young woman from the church, walking toward them with a few others from the congregation. The group had come to show their support, though many of them still looked nervous. The weight of standing up in a town this divided wasn't lost on anyone. Emily walked up to Claire, her face a mixture of resolve and fear. "We're here," she said, her voice stronger than before. "We're not backing down either." For a moment, the two women shared a look, a silent understanding passing between them. The battle they were facing wasn't just about laws or protests. It was about fighting for dignity, for recognition, for a better future. And they weren't going to let fear win. The protest began quietly but steadily. People filled the streets in front of the diner and spilled into the town square. The mood was more somber than the marches Claire had seen in bigger cities, but the energy was palpable. The people here had lived in fear for too long, and now they were standing together, pushing against the walls that had held them back for generations. Claire stood at the front, Tanya beside her, as they began to march down the main street, holding signs and chanting quietly at first, but with growing volume. "Respect, equality, justice," they called out, their voices rising, echoing in the stillness of the small town. A few of the townsfolk watched from their windows, their eyes narrowed with suspicion, but the crowd marched on, their resolve hardening with each step. Claire could hear the quiet whispers of support from those gathered. A few older women nodded from their front porches, some giving encouraging smiles. For a brief moment, Claire allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were making progress. But as they approached the town square, the first signs of resistance appeared. From the other side of the square, a group of men, some of the more vocal opponents of the protests, had gathered, their arms crossed, their faces twisted in anger. They shouted insults and jeers as Claire and the others marched past. But the protesters kept walking, undeterred. "Go back where you came from," one man yelled, his voice thick with disdain. "This is our town." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. The hostility was there, sharp and biting. The crowd faltered for a moment, but then Tanya, her voice clear and unshaken, called out, "We're not leaving. We're not going anywhere." Her words seemed to strike a chord. The group of protesters cheered, and their chants grew louder. "We are here to stay." But the men on the other side of the square only grew angrier. One of them, a burly figure Claire recognized from the diner, stepped forward, his face red with rage. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything?" he shouted. "You don't belong here. You're just stirring up trouble. Get out." Claire took a deep breath, standing her ground. "We belong here just as much as anyone else," she called back. "We're fighting for what's right." The burly man laughed harshly. "Right? You think you're doing this town a favor? You're dividing us, tearing us apart." A tense silence hung in the air for a moment, the crowd holding its collective breath. Claire's stomach twisted, but she refused to back down. She stepped forward, the people around her parting slightly to give her room. "I'm not here to divide anyone," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'm here because people like Tanya deserve to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. And I'm going to keep fighting for that, no matter what you say." The man scowled, clearly enraged. But before he could say another word, the group of protesters began chanting once more, drowning out his voice. Respect, equality, justice. Despite the opposition, the march continued, gaining strength with each step. Claire could feel the ground beneath her shift, the power of the protest growing. But the town's divide was becoming more and more evident. There was no easy middle ground. The lines were drawn, and now it was time for the town to decide which side it would stand on. Later that afternoon, as the protesters began to disperse, the atmosphere shifted again. People who had quietly watched from the sidelines now found their voices. Some of the men who had opposed the protest earlier were standing on street corners, yelling at anyone who passed by. "You're all fools," one man shouted at a group of young people leaving the protest. "You're letting them ruin everything. Don't you see what they're doing to this town?" Some of the people in the crowd stopped, their faces unsure, but many continued walking, ignoring the shouting. Claire couldn't help but notice a few who gave her silent nods of approval, their expressions uncertain but growing more resolved with each passing minute. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the distance, she heard sirens. Police cars, maybe. Tension was building, and Claire could feel it. This wasn't going to end quietly. That evening, as the protest wound down, Claire received a phone call that would change everything. The mayor was calling for an emergency town meeting. This time, the agenda wasn't about Claire's protests. It was about something far more dangerous. Word had spread that the council was considering issuing a curfew, blaming the protests for causing unrest in the town. The idea was to prevent any further demonstrations by force, to shut down the movement before it could gain more momentum. Claire could hear the anger in the mayor's voice. "This ends now," he said coldly. "You've pushed us too far, Claire. The town can't take much more of this." She stood there, holding the phone to her ear, feeling the weight of his words settle into her bones. This wasn't just about protests anymore. This was about their very right to be here, to be treated with dignity. It was about whether or not the town could be saved from itself. "I won't stop," Claire said quietly but firmly. "And you can't stop what's already begun." As she hung up the phone, the weight of the decision ahead of her settled in. The town was at a crossroads. They could either keep walking the path of division and fear, or they could come together for a better future. And Claire knew, with a certainty that burned in her chest, that she would fight for the future she believed in, no matter the cost. The atmosphere in the town had reached a boiling point. The curfew vote was scheduled for the following evening, and Claire knew that everything she had fought for, every protest, every tear, every ounce of energy she had spent, would come down to this one moment. She stood in the town square, alone at first, looking up at the tall, quiet buildings around her. It was surreal, knowing how much had changed since she first arrived in the town, how much she had put on the line. The protest had continued, though with rising tension. People were torn, and each day brought more conflict. Some of the townsfolk had started to show quiet signs of support, quick glances, subtle nods, a few handshakes after the protests. But the louder voices of dissent had also grown, more vicious and personal than ever before. Claire glanced over at the diner, where Tanya was now standing in the window, looking out at her. Claire waved, and Tanya gave her a small, weary smile, but Claire could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Tanya had seen enough of the backlash herself, yet, despite everything, she remained steady, her resolve hardening as Claire's did. "You know they're going to vote for it," a voice called from behind Claire, snapping her from her thoughts. She turned to find Pastor Grace standing there, a few paces away. Grace had been a quiet but steady ally throughout everything, offering Claire moral support in the face of endless pressure. "They might," Claire said, her voice tight with anxiety, "but I can't just back down. Not now. Not after everything we've already done." Pastor Grace sighed, stepping forward to stand beside her. I know it's hard, Claire, but you can't control what they do. What happens next is up to the town. If they vote for this curfew, if they choose fear and division, it won't be the end. It'll just be another hurdle. A big one, yes, but not the end." Claire nodded, though it felt more like a hollow promise than anything solid. "I hope you're right. I'm scared, not for me, but for Tanya, for all of us. I don't want to go back to the way things were." Grace smiled sadly, her hand resting lightly on Claire's shoulder. "You've already made a difference, Claire. You've woken people up, and that's something no vote can take away." Just then, a low rumble of distant voices reached their ears. Claire turned to look down the street, and her stomach clenched. The protesters were coming. This time, they weren't just standing in the square or marching quietly. The tension had built to a crescendo, and now they were ready to make their final statement. The crowd was larger than Claire had expected. It was a mix of people. Some familiar faces, some hesitant newcomers who had been pushed to act by the growing rift in the town. Tanya stood at the front of the group, her head held high, her sign firmly in hand. She was no longer afraid of the backlash. She was no longer afraid of what anyone would say. Claire knew this was the moment. This was the point of no return. Behind her, Emily and the rest of the church group arrived, carrying signs with messages of love and unity. Even a few of the townspeople who had been on the fence showed up, looking uncertain but determined. They marched quietly, but with palpable energy. They were ready. Together, they walked toward the town hall, every step a statement, every breath an act of defiance. The town hall loomed ahead, dark and imposing, but Claire didn't flinch. This was where they had to be. The council would decide the future of their town tonight, and they weren't going to let it happen without making their voices heard. As they neared the building, they were met by a line of officers, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the steps. The sight was jarring, their uniforms a stark contrast to the peaceful protesters. Claire stepped forward, her gaze meeting the officer in charge, a man Claire didn't recognize, but who wore a hardened expression. "You can't block the entrance," the officer said, his voice firm. "The council is meeting inside. You need to disperse." Claire raised her chin. "We're not blocking the entrance. We're here to be heard." The officer didn't move. "Disperse now, or we'll be forced to arrest." Claire's heart pounded, but she didn't back down. "We're not going anywhere. We have a right to be here." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Claire could feel the tension in the air. The officer stood his ground, but there was hesitation in his eyes. He was just following orders, but Claire could see the uncertainty there. He didn't want to be the one to escalate things further. "Let them through," a voice suddenly called from behind the officers. Everyone turned. Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was Frank, the farmer who had mocked her in the diner, the one who had been at the front of the opposition. But this time, there was something different in his expression. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared. It wasn't the defiance Claire had expected, but something else, something like recognition. "I said, let them through," Frank repeated, his voice steadier now. The officers looked at him for a long moment, exchanging glances. Frank stepped forward, gesturing for the crowd to follow. For a moment, there was silence. Claire could feel the eyes of the crowd on Frank, waiting for the next move. Then, slowly, one officer stepped aside, then another, until they were standing aside completely. Claire didn't hesitate. She led the way, walking up the steps toward the council doors, with Tanya and the others following her closely. They had made it past the line, but this was only the first step. The real battle would take place inside. Inside, the town council was already seated. The mayor and the rest of the council members looked up at the group as they entered, their faces a mix of surprise and barely contained frustration. Claire stood at the front, her heart pounding, but her voice clear as she addressed the room. "You're going to vote on a curfew tonight, on shutting down our right to be heard. But you can't silence us anymore," she said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about curfews or protests. This is about respect. It's about our right to be treated as equals in this town, and we won't let you take that away." There was a tense silence in the room. The council members exchanged glances, but no one spoke immediately. Claire could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, but she stood firm. She wasn't going to back down now. "We've heard enough of these speeches," Mayor Douglas finally sneered, leaning forward. "You've come here to cause trouble, Claire. This town has always been fine, and now you've stirred up chaos where there was none." "But there was chaos, Mayor," Claire said, her voice rising. "Chaos that's been there for years, buried under fear and hatred. And we're not going to stay silent about it anymore." The council members looked uncomfortable now, some fidgeting in their seats. The town hall had been split from the very beginning. Those who wanted change, those who feared it. And now, Claire could see that the cracks were widening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of tense silence, one of the council members, a woman Claire recognized as a quiet supporter, spoke up. "I don't know what's going to happen if we vote for this curfew," she said, her voice shaky. "But I do know this. We can't keep ignoring the people who are standing right in front of us. They have a right to be here. They have a right to be heard." The room went still. Claire held her breath, waiting for the next words. The mayor's face twisted with anger, but he was losing ground. The tide was turning. After what seemed like hours of back and forth, the vote was called. Claire stood beside Tanya, surrounded by the protesters, her pulse racing. She couldn't hear her own thoughts above the pounding of her heart. The council members cast their votes one by one, and Claire watched each one closely. When the last vote was tallied, the mayor slammed his gavel down. "It's over," he said, but his voice was weaker now. "The curfew is in place. We'll make sure this town gets back to normal." But the room erupted in chaos. The protesters shouted, but this time it was different. This time, it was the council members who looked uncertain, uneasy. The crowd's voices grew louder, not in anger but in unity. Then, something unexpected happened. Frank, the same man who had stood in their way earlier, stood up from his seat in the back. "I'm with them," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "We can't just keep pretending everything's fine." For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, one by one, others started to stand. The tide had turned. The council was fractured, and the town's future was no longer set in stone. The sun was setting over the town, casting a golden light on the town square where the protesters had gathered hours earlier. The council had voted in favor of the curfew, but the town's response had shattered the illusion of unanimous support for it. Though the curfew was technically in place, the faces of those in the crowd, gritty, tired but determined, told a different story. Claire walked down the main street, her footsteps slow but firm. She wasn't sure how it had happened, but there was something in the air now, A shift? After the vote, many of the townsfolk who had supported the curfew had started to second-guess their stance. Some of them spoke to Claire, quietly acknowledging the injustice they had tried to ignore for so long. Others, like Frank, had come forward to support the protesters publicly. It wasn't victory, but it was something. Something that felt like a turning tide. As Claire passed the diner, she saw Tanya through the window, wiping down the counter. She looked tired, but she was still there, still standing. Claire pushed open the door and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed, and Tanya looked up. Her face softened when she saw Claire. "How'd it go?" Tanya asked, her voice cautious but hopeful. Claire didn't speak right away. She just gave Tanya a long, steady look. The words, "we won," hung in the air, but they didn't feel right just yet. There was so much more to do. "We didn't win," Claire said softly, sitting at the counter beside Tanya. "Not yet, but things have changed. There's more support now. More people are listening. It's not over." Tanya nodded, leaning against the counter. "I don't know what to do with all of this," she murmured, looking out the window. "I never thought it would come to this, but I think I'm ready to fight for something bigger. Not just for me, for everyone who's been silenced for so long." Claire smiled at her, a rare sense of peace washing over her. "I think we're all ready, Tanya." There was a long pause between them, the kind that only comes when a deep understanding is shared. Tanya's voice broke the silence. "Do you think they'll let us keep fighting?" she asked, her eyes searching Claire's for reassurance. "We don't need their permission," Claire replied firmly. "We'll keep pushing together." The next day, Claire received a message that would change everything. It was from Emily, the young woman from the church who had joined the protest early on. Emily had become more involved with the movement in the last few weeks, and Claire had noticed her growing confidence. But this message wasn't just an update, it was a call to action. "Come to the church. We need to talk. There's something you need to hear," the text read. When Claire arrived at the church later that afternoon, she found a small group of people gathered inside. Emily was at the front, a determined expression on her face, flanked by several other members of the congregation. Some were familiar faces, others new, but all were clearly standing in solidarity. "We've been talking," Emily said, standing up from behind the pews, "and we want to help. We know the curfew is still in place, but we've had enough. We've seen the way people are hurting, and we can't just let it happen anymore. We want to make sure this town starts to heal." Claire raised an eyebrow, surprised by the earnestness in Emily's words. She'd seen Emily's growth in the last few weeks, but this felt different. Emily wasn't just a supporter anymore. She was a leader, stepping up to take action. "We're all with you," Emily continued, "but we need to make it clear that we stand together, no matter what. This town needs to hear our voices louder than ever before. If the council won't listen, we'll make sure the people hear us." Claire smiled, her heart swelling with hope. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The moment the town had reached a critical mass, a point where enough people were ready to stand up, no longer just as bystanders, but as active participants in creating change. "Let's do it," Claire said, her voice steady, though there was a fire in her chest now. "Let's make them listen." The next week, the church group, together with Claire and Tanya, called for a general strike. It wasn't just a protest. It was a stand that threatened to disrupt the flow of business in the town until real changes were made. The group issued a statement that the town's businesses, schools, and public offices would close for one day, in solidarity with those who had been affected by the curfew and the systemic racism that still plagued the town. At first, the response from the townspeople was mixed. Some were afraid of the consequences, afraid of what would happen if they stepped out of line. Others were angry, spurred on by the growing tension between the protesters and the more conservative factions of the town. But more and more people began to listen as news spread about the strike. The issue had gone beyond Claire and Tanya. It was now a town-wide issue. The day before the strike, Claire and Tanya stood together outside the diner, watching the street. The air was thick with anticipation, but there was a quiet optimism that hadn't been there before. "I can't believe it's come to this," Tanya said softly. "It feels like everything's about to change. I just don't know how." Claire placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I know it's scary, but it's the only way to make them see. This town can't ignore us anymore. Tanya looked at Claire, her eyes brimming with unspoken emotions. I never thought I'd be standing here like this. I never thought I'd be part of something so big. You're not just part of it, Tanya. You're helping to lead it, Claire said firmly. You've been fighting this battle longer than I have, and you've taught me what real strength looks like. Tanya smiled, her eyes misting over. We're stronger together. The day of the strike arrived. By the morning, the town was buzzing with uncertainty. The streets were quieter than usual. School buses didn't roll through the neighborhood, and shops remained shuttered. At first, the town seemed paralyzed, unsure of what would happen next. Tension was high, but so was the resolve of those who had come together for this cause. Claire, Tanya, and Emily walked together through the streets, their signs held high. The small group was growing. More people were joining them every hour. The streets, once a battleground of anger and division, were now filled with unity, with people from all walks of life standing side by side. Teachers, factory workers, businessmen, farmers, all marching together with one goal in mind: to be seen, to be heard. As they approached the town square, Claire saw Frank standing at the front, holding a sign that read, "Justice for All." He wasn't the only one. People who had once resisted were now stepping forward. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The council had already started to meet in the town hall, no doubt discussing what actions to take in response to the strike. But the voices outside were growing louder, chanting, "No justice, no peace." Inside the council chamber, the mayor sat with a grim expression. The curfew was still in place, but with every passing minute, the pressure outside grew. The town was shifting, and as the mayor looked out the window toward the street, he saw what he couldn't ignore. People were rising, and they weren't backing down. For the first time in years, the mayor understood that his control over the town was slipping. He stood up, his voice shaking as he spoke to the council. "We can't keep doing this. We can't keep pretending everything's fine while the people are hurting. It's time to change." The vote came unexpectedly fast. With the council chamber filled with people from both sides of the debate, the mayor finally raised his gavel, his voice surprisingly quiet as he spoke. "We've heard the people. We've heard their pain. And tonight, we will act," he said. After a long silence, the vote was called. The curfew was lifted. A new town ordinance was passed, calling for the establishment of a commission dedicated to racial equity to examine the town's practices and make changes. Claire stood outside, watching the faces of the people around her. They weren't celebrating, not yet, but they were hopeful. The fight wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. Tanya, standing beside her, whispered, "We did it." "No," Claire corrected, her eyes on the crowd, the future of the town unfolding before them. "We're doing it."